I am so excited to see you all here today, because if you're here, that means that you want to be an open source contributor. And for me, this has been one of the greatest joys of my life, but I'm also kind of sad to see you here today because you haven't felt comfortable jumping in yet, right? And I think that there are a lot of big things that prevent people from feeling comfortable stepping into open source. A lot of people are confused about where to start. There's a whole ocean of repositories and issues out there. It can be hard to know where to begin. It can be hard to understand the differences between open source contribution and your day job and some of the technical differences that occur because of that. But I think the number one biggest thing that scares and intimidates people when it comes to open source is the review process. It is incredibly vulnerable to put your code out there in public and to have somebody review it, critique it, and decide whether or not it's acceptable. And I think a lot of that comes from the way that we view maintainers as lofty heroes of the internet. And what I'd hope to do today is to break through all of these barriers that you may have been feeling and to answer these questions, starting with the number one question I get every single time I work in open source on stream, which is, why are you doing your job for free or very, very cheap? So the first thing I want to say to this is that you are not, right? Your work, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, is a treadmill of issues that you have to complete in order to take care of your needs and your family and to ensure that you have stability. That obligation kind of affects how you feel about it, right? And open source is an expression of joy. It is creating things purely because you like the idea of creating it. The difference between a hobby and a job is whether or not you choose to do it. And as a contributor, you have the choice. But most of the time when I provide this answer to these people, they don't really agree or understand it. So let's talk about the tangible benefits to you as a developer. So these first two, new skills and experience and learn from experts, really comes from having the opportunity to get outside your organization, right? Inside your organization, you have access to the projects, the stacks, and the architectures that they're comfortable with, right? And you have access to the experts who are within your organization. But when you step into open source, you expand the possibilities. If you've been working with object-oriented, you have the opportunity to see what a live, large-scale, functional program looks like. If you've been wanting to play with Rust, isn't it nice to build something larger than a tutorial app? You have so many opportunities to meet people that you would never have the opportunity to meet from within your organization, and that comes from getting outside of it. The other big one is right to repair. I don't know about you, but if I've ever encountered a bug or an issue with a tool, there's this little voice in the back of my head that just screams, if you would just let me at the code, I would fix this myself. And with open source, that's no longer a statement of frustration. It's a statement of power, capability, and the things that you can do, right? One of the examples that I have for this is I constantly see people on Twitter who are like, at the practical dev, please grant me this feature. At the practical dev, by the way, are the folks behind Dev2 and Code Newbies. And the entire platform that they use to run those is open source, right? It's called 4M, and it's a Rails repo, and you can actually go there, and they have an entire feature request process, and you can be part of the project that brings the feature you wanted to life. Instead of being caught in this cycle of begging for people to build things for you on Twitter, you can be part of the process of creating that, and that is incredibly empowering. But this last reason is the reason that I got into open source, is having a library of examples. So I was looking for a new job, right? And they asked me for a code sample. And I looked through my open source repos and everything, things that aren't locked behind copyright and that I can actually share. And I see nothing but tutorial apps, minor things that I've built and played with. They didn't reflect my true skills, right? More so than necessarily passing an interview or wanting an example to show people what I was capable of. What hurt the most was knowing that the best code of my career was going to be locked in someone else's private repo. Inside open source, I may not own the code that I've written, but at the very least, I have access to it. I can reference it when I want to build new solutions, and my history of accomplishments does not end when I change careers. That is the reason that I got started with open source. And let's start talking about how you'll get started in open source. Most people are going to tell you to find an issue, right? An issue, by the way, for those of you in Jira land, is not necessarily a problem. It could be a task, a story, or another name. But they'll tell you to look for something tagged good first issue. There's even sites dedicated to this. But I think that this is the wrong approach, and here's why. Dev environment setup is hard. Learning a new code base is hard. And if you are constantly hopping from good first issue to good first issue, you are constantly repeating these two steps. So instead, I think what you should do is you should find a good first repo. Now, what makes a good first repo is going to be different for every single one of you, but this is the things that I care about, and I hope that it helps you find your own list. So the first thing I look for is interest. I want a reason to come back. Is it a tool I use? Does it have a charitable purpose, an interesting tech stack? The next thing I do is I look at the closed PRs. This lets me know how long it takes for a review to happen, how long and how in-depth those reviews are. This allows me to set my own expectations for the review process and also to make sure that those expectations align with what I'm comfortable with. I think that a lot of the frustration we see in open source comes from contributors who have different expectations than maintainers can really keep up with. The next thing I look for is a Docker and Codespaces setup. Anything that can reduce that dev environment setup and allows me to throw away the environment afterwards is incredibly helpful. And then for your first one, I strongly recommend Stack Experience, which in this case would be Ruby, right? So you're going to be learning about forked repositories. You're going to be learning about how to interact with maintainers and contributors. That's a lot of things to pick up at once. So make your life a little easier and pick a stack you already know. The last and most important one is clear issues. So out of all the repositories that I've contributed to, the one that I like the most is Casa, which is an app created by Ruby for Good. And the reason is specifically because of this. The issues are clear, they're easy to understand, and they're easy to work on. When I think about a good first issue, I think a good first issue is small in scope, well-defined, and reproducible. You want it to be reproducible because you want to know when you're done. You want it to be well-defined. I've seen people pick up issues where it's a UI change, but there isn't a mock-up. And this can create lengthy review processes where what the maintainers want and what the contributor has delivered are different. The other one is small in scope. Change the color of a button. Like, it's fine. Your heroic PR can be your second PR. Because we're going to stay with this repo for a little while. All right, I want to continue to dig into this because I think that finding the right first issue can really set you up for success in open source. So I want to break these down into a couple of different categories that I see that are really common. The first one being the most difficult, which is setup changes. A lot of times when contributors approach this, they think, oh, well, I'm going to adjust the setup and I'm going to give other contributors a way to access this project in the same way that I do, right? And here's a little audience participation. Can I ask you, how many of you have heard of Maven, M-A-V-E-N? Oh, there's a fair few of you. Nice to see you all here. Okay, so in college, I had not heard of Maven, and it was my first introduction to it. And my friend had this little Ruby on Rails app, and he turns to me and he goes, somebody has Mavenized my repo. And I went, they what your repo? And he says, they Mavenized it. And I'm like, what does that mean? And he said, I have no idea. Maven, by the way, for those of you who did not raise your hands, is a set of build tools commonly associated with Java, right? And I think when you are a contributor, you're thinking, I want to give other people a way to access this repo in the same way that I'm comfortable with. But as a maintainer, you're thinking, this sets an expectation that this repo will be accessible using Maven for the rest of the time that it's available. Like, contributors will start using that setup, which means it needs to be maintained. Another thing people commonly forget about is that build tools are some of the hardest to test in dev environment setups. As a maintainer, you have to completely uninstall your dev environment and recreate it using this setup. So that's why while setup changes feel like a good first contribution, they're some of the hardest to get merged, and they can be very challenging for maintainers. The next one is unrequested refactors. If it's requested, go free. But the way I see it, there's three major things. The first of which is that the maintainer could say, this is no longer consistent with the rest of the code base, and other contributors who are looking at it in one place and moving to another are going to be confused about how these are related. The next one is that the maintainer may not like your changes, right? Code aesthetics are a very personal choice, and that can be a really challenging thing to get merged. And then the last part of this is even if the maintainer likes your changes, likes your refactor, and thinks that it is a good option, what they may say is you've moved a lot of tests, changed a lot of code, and you've created merge conflicts for other contributors in this repository, and our users have no new features and no new capabilities. So even if they like it, it still may go unmerged. The next one that I want to talk about is this challenging but rewarding category. I love these, and they're such an exciting thing to work on. Like, new features is what we talked about before. It's empowering, it's exciting, but again, it sets up this expectation from users of that project that that feature will be extended, maintained, and the bugs that are introduced with it are going to be picked up by maintainers. So when you create new features, you need to make a case for why this is valuable, not just for you, but for other people in that and other people who use that project. This next one is different from the rest of them. So the first three here, you're kind of having a maintainer as an obstacle, like they don't want to merge this particular PR. But documentation is always welcome. It helps contributors, it helps maintainers, it helps users of the project. And in addition to that, it's very low risk. It's very easy for maintainers to merge it and rest assured that there are going to be no issues with the code base. But I think what we need to acknowledge here is that documentation is incredibly challenging in and of itself for a new user of that code base, right? So if we sit here and we say, I would like you to write documentation for this method, by its very nature, that method is undocumented. And documentation isn't about, here are the parameters that you pass to this method. That's facile, right? What's important is to explain why and how this method is used. And if it's undocumented, the person who is contributing, who is visiting this repository for the first time, has to divine from where this method is called and all of the methods it calls and all of the little side effects and things that may be hidden within it, how this method is intended to be used. However, like I said, these are incredibly welcome. Maintainers are willing to partner with you and they're willing to help you with expanding the why and how and building great documentation. But we as an industry need to acknowledge that figuring out purely from the code what something's purpose is difficult. And then taking that and writing it in such a way that people who are familiar with the project can read it quickly. People that are new to the project have a thorough explanation of what's happening within it, and that it's clear enough that folks who have English as a second language can understand and read what's happening. That is an incredibly challenging task, and we need to acknowledge that. This last category, oh, thank you. This last category are the easier and more welcome ones. So with an existing issue, you have a buddy, right? There's a chance the maintainer's already seen it, and honestly, having another person to back you up on whether this is valuable and another person to work with, potentially even to pair program with, can make this a lot easier. The next category is extending. So one of the PRs that I'm most proud of is the comparison validator that's coming out in Rails 7. The idea is that you would be able to say that a start date is before an end date, right? And when I built this, what I was able to do is I was able to look at existing validators in Rails and say, hey, this one uses comparisons. This one extracts common language or common information into a module and imports it into two validators. I was able to look and say like, hey, there's test cases. There's a test framework that's already built for these. And I was able to reuse a lot of what was there. I think that extending is one of the great powers of open source because maintainers can build a pattern and then open source contributors can swarm on it and extend it and expand on it. The last gold standard are ones that are tagged good first issue. This means the maintainer has looked at it. They think it's going to be a small change. And honestly, these are some of the first to go, which is why I want to talk about some of these other categories. There's something that I've been implying here that I want to make very explicit. Maintainers live with the code that you deliver, right? You drop it off, but when it comes to the bug requests, when it comes to the extensions, when it comes to the user expectations, maintainers are really thinking about the long-term future of the code that you've provided. And I think that this is something that really helps us understand how maintainers and contributors interact. All right, but the next thing that I want to talk about is how to understand what maintainer expectations are, right? Maintainers have literally written you a letter in the repository inviting you to contribute and telling you how they want you to contribute and be part of their organization. This is included in the contributing.md. Sometimes for larger repos like Forum and Rails, it's a whole site. For smaller ones, sometimes it's just a section in the README. But this really is how you know what is acceptable and what's okay inside of that project. This is going to include information like style guidelines, documentation, how to request review and claim an issue, and most importantly, it's going to have information about your developer setup and your tests. And I want to talk about one specific thing about open source. So in your daily projects, what you probably do is you reach out to IT and you're like, I would like to be added to this particular project. And you provide them with your GitHub username, and then maybe they ask you, like, which projects do you need to be part of? What are you working on? They add you to a team. That is a cumbersome process for open source. And also, maintainers often worry that they'll be responsible for any content that's been uploaded on branches. So instead, we use forked repositories, right? So what you do is you have the original repo. This is the location where everything is. This is where others' changes are, this is where the maintainers are, and then you fork that repo and it creates a copy that is on your account. That is where your changes in local dev environment live. That's where you're going to push your changes, that's where you clone them. And then at the end, what you do is you point your PR towards the original repo. If you do not point your PR towards the original repo as demonstrated at the bottom of the screen, what will happen is they will not see it. It will exist purely on your account and it will not be reviewed. And speaking of PRs, let's talk about ways to give your PR the best chance for success. Give it a clear description. Why do we want this? What does it change? What are some of the potential impacts? What are the resources that you used in figuring this out? Make it easy. Make it small and single purpose, and also make sure the tests and linting pass. I'm going to tell you exactly how I maintain and manage my repos. What I do is I look at the list of PRs, I start at the bottom, I go through all of the green ones, and I literally go up from the bottom, and then I go through the red ones. The bottom ones, by the way, are some of the oldest ones. And I think what's important to remember here is with these small and single purpose ones, I'll often review it based on how long and how many files it is. Like if it's 1 to 3 files, I'll probably do it at work and nobody will be the wiser, right? If it's 5 to 10 files, we're waiting until the end of the day. If it's 30 plus files, we're waiting until the heat death in the universe. I'm so sorry. I really want to review your PR and I haven't closed it, but it's 30 plus files and that's a lot to review. Next one, you want to make sure it's easy to test, reproduce. This ties into the description. And then the last one is you want to make sure that you're giving maintainers a quick response. These are the people who are going to merge your PR. The shorter you can make that feedback cycle, the faster this will be merged. Okay. We covered a lot of information there. Let's take a moment and kind of sit with it. Our first step is we find a repo, then we find an issue, then we read the contributing.md, fork the repo, git clone the forked repo locally, set up your dev environment, and then reproduce the issue. Okay, so the vast majority of issues in open source are very, very bad. They're created by volunteers. Sometimes there's environment issues. Sometimes it's been closed in a separate PR. Like, you cannot trust these issues. Make sure you reproduce them. Next step is code, documenting, or translate. I know you can do this. I fully believe in your ability to write code, document, and translate. And I think a lot of people overestimate what is required, right? Like a lot of times the issue will even have like some basic implementation information. So I believe in you and I believe in your ability to complete this step. Last step, create a PR and point it to the original repo. If you've followed all these, you have created a PR! Woo! Round of applause, you are amazing. That is enough. Just creating the PR is worth the effort. There are a lot of things that are gonna happen after this stage. There's gonna be a lot of back and forth, but this was worth it. So my first PR, right, was an image change to a Minecraft guide. Literally, it was a one-line change to swap a tool rack with a cow in a jar. It had documentation, it had comments, it had a little description and everything, and it went unmerged for 4 years. But what it did is it taught me how to work with forked repos. It made me feel confident in my ability to participate in open source. So then when I saw that Dev2 had Vimeo and they had YouTube, but they didn't have Twitch embeds, I said, well, you know what? There are some examples there. I know how forked repos work. I can go in and I can add that. Dev2, by the way, uses liquid tags in order to handle adding embeds and that sort of stuff. So I created a PR to embed Twitch clips. When I started working with Jekyll, right, I saw that they used liquid tags. Regardless of whether the Dev2 one was merged, I now knew how to create a Twitch liquid tag, right? And I felt confident in my abilities to do so. So what I did is I learned how to make a gem in order to wrap that liquid tag, which means now at this point, I know how to make a gem. That story started with a PR that sat unmerged for 4 years, right? Each step in that journey is worth it, even if the immediate results aren't what you wanted. Building that muscle, contributing to open source, being part of that community is worth it. And there are a lot of reasons your PR might be unmerged that have nothing to do with you. So for example, your maintainer may have 20 other PRs to review. They may be on vacation. They may have a big work project. Most maintainers have a 40-hour-a-week job in addition to what they're working on, and we all know those 40 hours a week can sometimes turn into 60 to 70. And if that happens, your PR may go unmerged and unattended for a while. One of the harder ones is they may have found it hard to read or follow your PR, and it may be waiting for that reason. They may be figuring out how to say no. They may have decided, despite your case, despite your explanation, that your feature isn't one that they want to merge into the project. And that's a hard thing to deal with, but it's a possibility. On the other hand, there may be future work happening there, right? They may decide that there's additional work that's going to be set up. They don't know for sure like what the expectations are, and this may make the re-architecture or the merges more difficult, right? So these are all reasons that your PR might be unmerged despite it being beautiful, well-written code, right? Next, we're gonna talk a little bit about maintainers and contributors, because I think this is where a lot of the anxiety comes from, is this kind of fear of being reviewed in public. So you have your contributors, and there are a lot of things that you do, right? Creating issues, updating documentation, creating and reviewing PRs once you're familiar with the repository itself. But with maintainers as a team, they're responsible for a lot more. They're merging PRs, releasing new versions, deploying to production, and really setting the direction for the project. They are focused on the project needs. As a contributor, you get to explore and focus on your needs, and you get to adventure. A maintainer has responsibility for the success of that project and making sure that it continues to work for those users. So that kind of begs the question, like, why would you maintain a project, right? Why would you take on that responsibility? And I think there's 3 big reasons I've heard of. You want it to exist. You want to share what you've built. Sometimes these people don't accept contributions. They're just like, I just want to show you what I've built and you can copy it. The biggest reason, though, is you want help building it. All of these, though, boil down to the same thing, which is that maintainers care about the project. And you, when you contribute, you are gifting your time and attention to the project that they care about. There are a lot of things that get in the way, right? There are busy work schedules, and there are egos and conversations and a lot of other things, and whether or not this is for the best of the project. But at the end of the day, you contribute to the success of the project, and maintainers know that. They want you there. That's why they wrote a letter to you in the contributing.md. They want you to be part of the project. I think of open source as a community garden, right? The maintainers are there and they're like, oh no, that's not a weed, that's actually a butterfly host plant. Here's where the paths are. Please don't go through those gardens. Oh my God, there's so many of you here and I don't know how to handle it. But without you, it's not a community garden. It's just a garden, right? Like, you are what makes an open source project successful and amazing. So don't be scared, meet a nice repo and build something beautiful. And when you do, please tell me what you built. I go by Chael or Rachel. You can find me at Chael Codes in the places you typically find a developer. I stream open source on Twitch on Sundays and 2 other days a week as well. So that's a really great place to find me. I'm a senior full stack engineer at Calendly, and of course, we are hiring. Also, I maintain an app called Conf Buddies that's built in Rails. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to befriend other people at a conference and then know when you're attending events together. If you're still anxious about the process of open source, hi, I can be your first maintainer, and I promise it'll be a good experience. Thank you all so much for coming, and do you have any questions? Oh, wait, sorry. Thank you all so much for coming! Do you have any questions? Yes. Hello. Yes, you in the white cardigan and the very nice black shirt.
Yeah, thank you. So I've seen on some repos they have a practice of like requesting to be assigned to an issue.
Yeah.
At like what stage should I ask to be assigned? Like, should I go and scope out the problem first, or as soon as I see what I'm interested in, go ahead and ask for that?
It really depends on when you're comfortable being responsible for completing that issue. Personally, I go scope it out first. I'm like, where am I going to make the changes? Like, what's this going to look like? Do I really want this issue, or is it going to be bigger than I think it is? And then what I do is I ask to be assigned. Oftentimes, I'll send the message asking to be assigned, and then I'll get started on the pull request, even though I haven't been assigned yet. But yeah, that's a great question.
And what if you realize it's above your head and you've already been assigned? Is there a way to like back out gracefully?
Absolutely. So most maintainers are incredibly understanding of the fact that like you want to step away. In fact, a lot of maintainers, what they do is they actually set up bots to unassign people, because you don't want to say like, hey, this person hasn't touched it for a month, like we want to give it to somebody else, because you're worried about upsetting that contributor. I think people don't realize how often maintainers think about whether or not their contributors feel comfortable in their project, because it's entirely written communication. Compron had a great talk at Strange Loop about like all of the processes. And one of the things that she said was she automated the emotional labor by having a process to unassign people. So if you realize it's too much, like feel free. Even an hour later, like a week later, definitely like don't even worry about it. Like they'll understand. Yes, in the Weed Maps mask. Sorry, it's the most identifiable thing.
That's what it was. I wasn't sure what this was. But thank you. Good talk, by the way. Awesome.
Thank you.
Very, very helpful. I did have a question regarding like picking up an issue. Similarly, like in Jira, they could depend on somebody else, or maybe you have to wait and you have to contribute with someone else as well. What's the process there? What if do you have to kind of find time to work with someone else, or you're blocked by somebody else's work at the time, or I don't know, maybe someone else is relying on you?
Yeah, so blockers are significantly less common in open source than they are in our everyday workplaces, because people understand that you could step in at any step of the process and like pick up the issue. It's far more common for an issue to be broken down into like this needs to be created, and then later the second issue will be created. Because also maintainers don't know how long it's going to take for someone to pick up the issue. So most of the times they don't create the second one until afterwards. But if so, like normally what happens is after the first one is merged, that's when the second one becomes available to pick up. Does that answer your question? Yes, in the front row.
You said the thing about having someone document how the code works is actually like a really difficult task.
Yes.
And that unlocked like a feral anger in me that I forgot I had. Because a lot of times you onboard to an engineering team, or an engineering team has a new hire and they're like, yeah, we're just gonna turn you loose and have you write some documentation. And I'm always like, I actually don't think that's a good task. But I didn't really understand why. Are there other things that you've learned from open source that you feel like have changed how you approach like, you know, your kind of like paid daytime job?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned before that open source is mostly happening remote, asynchronously. So when I stepped back into the corporate world, I was kind of like, oh, I'm ready for this. What I do is I document a lot more and describe what I'm trying to do. A lot of times we'll say like, oh, I need to know how to build this. Like I'm gonna set a 30-minute meeting on someone's calendar. But your memory of that 30-minute meeting is less accurate after an hour, and I guarantee a month later you're going to completely forget what y'all agreed to and said unless it's written down. And that's why having conversations on pull requests, communicating what you're looking for, allows that conversation to be available years later. And my time in open source has kind of trained me to approach things from a remote first perspective and a written first perspective, which I think is incredibly helpful. Thank you. Oh, yes.
Hi there. So I have a question. If you are struggling with your local development setup or reproducing the issue, is there like a good way to get unblocked or communicate with the maintainers that would be like more effective?
Absolutely. So the first approach, I think, is to really comment on the issue and say, I was unable to reproduce this, and here's why. I think the second main way that you can do this is you can look and see if they have a community Discord, if they have a community Slack, because a lot of much larger projects have these. And I think that that's a good way to approach it, but my first instinct would be to comment on the issue. This is asynchronous, and it's one of the places where things kind of break down because it takes a little bit longer. But yeah, that would be my first approach, because again, a lot of these issues are not going to be valid, right? Like, you need to take the time to reproduce them, and if you comment on it, it may just get closed. Yes, thank you. That was a great question. Are there any further questions? I want to thank you all so much for coming here. If you want to ask me further questions, oh, goodness gracious, I'm so sorry. You can again find me on Twitch. My Twitter DMs are open. I'm on the Discord, and feel free to grab me in the halls. I like meeting new people, and I like talking with you all. And also, when I said, tell me what you built, I mean it. Tell me when you change the color of a button, and I will be so incredibly excited with you. Thank you all so, so much, and I appreciate you. Okay, I should take this.